Okay, thanks everybody, and thanks for coming out on a Saturday to talk about really important discussion. If you were lucky enough to be here for the previous panel, there was a very detailed and well-framed discussion on the major stories that are being covered from the region, the Middle East, and basically some of the fallacies of that coverage and some of the things that are missing. We'd like to jump right off on that. This is a panel about women. Obviously, I'm not a woman. But I believe very strongly that issues about women should involve discussions with men, because pretty much men are perpetrators of offenses against women. We have a very distinguished panel here, and I want to get right to the panel. My name is Lonnie Isabel, by the way. I'm a teacher here at the J School and a former foreign editor and foreign correspondent. We have with us, to my immediate left, Professor Nahed El-Tantawi, who is an associate professor at High Point University, and she teaches convergent journalism and also gender studies, and she's written a lot about stereotyping. And here's a quote from her. "I refuse to be lumped in this monolithic group of oppressed, abused, and hated victims." Next to her, we have Nina Ansari, who is a scholar, historian, and also a columnist for the Daily Beast and the Huffington Post, Women's E-News, and other things. And she's author of a new book. In fact, she just came from her book tour in Europe to be with us. The book is called Jewels of Allah. And what it is a book that, again, talking about stereotypes, is described as shattering stereotypes about women in Iran. And Publishers Weekly called it a riveting portrait of the Iranian woman, her strength, resilience, suffering, and hope. And to my far left is Lisa Goldman, who is a Canadian-Israeli journalist, and she works for Plus In72, an organization I'm quite familiar with, because if you look at this collective blog, and reported blog, you would find some of the best coverage of the occupied territories. And this blog includes Palestinian writers. And she's here to talk with us about one of the things that's neglected in talking about women in the Middle East, which is the fact that there are Israeli women, and they themselves have some issues with the images that are portrayed of them. So I wanted to start right out on this concept of stereotyping. Stereotyping. This is a negative thing in every mind. It means basically that people's images are manipulated in a way that presents them in a negative light. And so, Professor Nahed, I'd like to ask you about the particular brand of stereotyping of Muslim, Middle Eastern, Arab, Israeli, all women in that region. What are some of the most egregious things you see about the stereotyping?
Okay, first of all, good morning. We're still morning, I think. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks to all the organizers. Some of the most common stereotypes we see for Middle Eastern women, not including Israeli women though, is one, we tend to lump all these women into this one monolithic group. They're all wear the black garb, from head to toe. They're all Muslim. Ignoring the fact that the Middle East is housed to just 20% of the Muslims worldwide. The bulk of Muslims are not in the Middle East, and the Middle East is much more diverse. You have other minorities, you have other religions, you have atheists, and within the Muslim community, they're not all of the same level of faith, so they don't all wear a head cover or a face cover, and if they do, it's not all black. What they wear in Saudi Arabia is different from what they wear in Iran, and very diverse from what people wear in Egypt, Lebanon, and so forth. Other stereotypes that we see, this fascination, I can't call it anything else, but this fascination with the veil, whether it's a face veil or a headscarf, it's usually in the story. It makes its way in the story, even if it's just one line. Wearing her headscarf, she said so-and-so. And sometimes it's not even in the story, but there's a picture of a woman wearing the veil, and the story itself has nothing to do with the veil. And you've probably seen this cartoon or a version of it of a woman with a head or like a burqa, and it has this imprisoned bars, and she's screaming, "Help me" or "Help." And that's the other side of it. It's when we do portray or cover the veil, it's always seen as this oppressive, imprisoning garment that women, we just have to take it off and liberate them, okay? And then the last most common type of stereotype that I see is, it goes back to Edward Said's Orientalism. How Said looked at how Orientalists describe this Muslim other, this female other. She's oppressed, she's voiceless, she's helpless. And so you will indeed find stories that say that. Just 3 days ago, there was a story from the UK on a Muslim woman, and the headline read, "Helpless Muslim woman attacked by Islamophobics." Why the need for helpless? Just tell us what happened. But you always find the language, these words or phrases that take us back to Orientalist descriptions of Muslim women.
So there are very few people I describe as sort of fierce. Our next guest, Nina Ansari, is fierce. Her writing is extremely pointed and strong about Iranian women. And most people don't understand Iran. I mean, Iran is a country in that region that has the highest penetration of computer users, very highly literate and educated community. So, Nina, why did you feel it was so important to write a book that shattered the stereotypes of Iranian women?
First of all, good morning. Lonnie, thank you for the kind introduction. This book is based on my doctoral thesis that I wrote in 2013 for Columbia University, specifically on the feminist movement in Iran, post-revolutionary Iran. Another stereotype that I wanted to shatter was the face of Iran over the last 37 years has been the Islamic Republic, and women are generally depicted as in seclusion, predominantly behind the veil. Now, what's important and counterintuitive on many levels is that despite the gender discriminatory laws in post-revolutionary Iran, you have a highly educated female population with women surpassing men in higher education. You have a vibrant feminist movement that's ongoing despite the patriarchy. You also have this image of women in Iran, as Nahid had said, that generally lump women in the Middle East as, again, helpless and in need of assistance. Women in Iran are not helpless. They do need a voice on the outside in order to draw attention to their plight. And by plight, I mean the plight of numerous women's rights activists who continuously pay a high price for their peaceful activism, for trying to reverse the discriminatory gender laws. That's where they need help, but they're not helpless. In fact, what's very important about women in Iran today is that they actually set an important precedence that you can be discriminated and oppressed within the laws, but that doesn't necessarily translate into who you are as a person, and that's very important for women in other nations and other countries that oppress you simply based on your gender, that you do not have to bend and surrender to the laws. So, Lonnie, you asked me why I wrote this book, was again to really as an homage to Iranian women who continue to fight an uphill battle with remarkable courage, grace, and dignity. It's an homage to Iranian women through the centuries. There are so many narratives about bold Iranian women, even in the mid-1800s, that have gone unnoticed. I was hoping, in a very small way, even to bring their voices out. We talk a lot about who knew Iran even had a first suffrage martyr in the mid-1800s. So these are the voices of women who need to be brought out as part of a collective global sisterhood. So that is one of the main reasons that I rewrote my doctoral thesis as a mainstream narrative.
And we will explore those themes. I wanted to ask Lisa, who, as I said, is a journalist from Israel, who covers, most of the times I've seen descriptions of the blog as controversial.
Who said that?
Just about everyone. And I think it might be because of subject matter. I'd like for you to address that, but I also want you to speak to the image of Israeli women. Mm-hmm. Soldier, mother, patriot, Jewish fighter. Is that image accurately portrayed?
It depends who's making the portrayal, right? Well, I just start off by first of all saying that it's important not to forget that 20% of Israel's population is Palestinian, and most of that Palestinian population is Muslim. There's a very small Christian minority. So for Israeli Jewish women, we have universal conscription for all Jews in Israel, unless they're religious women. So secular women go to the army, and they don't go, usually they don't have anything to do with combat. So the image of the Israeli woman has been sort of this, very much on an equal plane with men, and so she's shouldering her gun and she's serving in the army, but women don't serve in combat roles in the Israeli army. They sometimes are involved in training male soldiers to go into combat, and there was in the 80s they started conscripting female pilots for the Air Force, but there are still very, very few of them. So what happens is that because the army is such a dominant institution in Israeli society with universal conscription and frequent security issues, every time there's a major sort of uptick in violence or a war, you have saturation coverage on the news, and you have panels of analysts, and they're all male analysts, because people who become analysts of military matters in Israel tend to be people who have served in combat roles in the army, usually as officers. So the atmosphere, the prevailing atmosphere, is sort of very male-dominated when it comes to these issues. And there is a feminist movement in Israel, and there are some very prominent female feminist academics who focus on the field, but there hasn't ever been a feminist revolution in Israel, like the one that we had here in the States in the late 60s and early 70s, because women from Israel's inception in 1948 were considered liberated. They tilled the land side by side with their men, and they served in the army, and so, but actually they were sort of relegated within that framework to very traditional roles, and you're seeing that sort of not really changing in Israeli society. Yes, it's a socially liberal society. It's even progressive. You have same-sex marriage, which is not legal, but you can register a partnership, and you have very sexually liberated Jewish society, I think. But I think that the traditional roles for women are still very, very prominent, and that's really exacerbated by the security situation and by the dominance of the army. Now, among the Palestinian population, the veil is very much of a political issue. Just today, for example, a friend of mine sent me a link to a blog post by an Israeli Jewish woman who lives in the mixed city of Jaffa, which is actually part of Tel Aviv, and it's mixed Arab Jewish. And she wrote that, in a sort of half-guilty tone, that the municipality had sent, apparently, a Muslim woman as a substitute teacher to her son's kindergarten. And everyone's in an hysterical panic because of the ongoing security situation in Israel. And they didn't know that this woman was going to show up. So she shows up wearing a jilbab, the long sort of traditional dress that some Muslim women wear, and a veil, the headscarf. And the security guard pushed her away, and the teacher tried to shove her out the door. The other teacher tried to shove her out the door. The parents were were in an uproar, and ultimately she was sent home. So the veil sort of becomes a political issue and a class issue and an identifier, and it affects the position also of women in their own Muslim society. I mean, obviously, I'm not an expert on the issues within Israeli-Palestinian society, but I do have friends who work as social workers in some of the inner city neighborhoods, and they tell me that a lot of the times women, especially teenagers, wear the veil because their brothers and fathers won't let them out of the house, and they're not particularly religious, but that wearing the veil gives them the freedom to go out and meet their friends for coffee, and the freedom to go to a movie. So, it upsets their Jewish friends, but it allows them a certain measure of freedom that they otherwise wouldn't have within their own society. So it's a very complex picture.
Yes, that word again, complexity. The narrative of women as victims is one of the themes that you've all talked about, this whole narrative. And of course, we all know that stereotyping, the foundation of it, is propaganda. Basically, it's political. Where does this narrative come from? Where does it emanate from, and why is it so difficult to eradicate from our popular lives?
Okay.
Who goes?
Nina, you take that.
I wanted to sort of build on what Lisa said because it threads into what you asked about the veil. Specifically, the veil, how everyone looks at the veil as an emblem of oppression, servitude, and that is not necessarily so. Again, everyone who wears the veil is lumped into one category, and that narrative keeps perpetuating itself over and over again. Now, for some women, actually wearing the veil, like Lisa said, is empowering. You know, some women wear the veil, they can come out, they feel good about themselves, they feel protected. It's not necessarily done because it's law or mandated. Now, to look at any woman and her attire and assume she's oppressed because she's covered is so erroneous. That gets perpetuated specifically in mainstream media all the time. Look at that poor helpless woman who's covered from head to toe. Now, you know, all this leads to, again, what Lisa brought up initially when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power and mandated the veil. That actually empowered so many women to come out of their homes and go get an education. Now, again, during the Shah, where there was a veil choice, there was a more Western climate, a lot of fathers and husbands were not comfortable letting their wives out without the veil, and you brought this up. A lot of women were wearing the veil not because they wanted to, but because it was mandated by the male in their households. So this narrative, again, about looking at women and their attire strictly from a Western perspective is erroneous. Every woman should be looked at as an individual, and if she chooses to, you know, either wear or not wear something, she shouldn't be just prejudged for it. So that's, again, something that I think maybe it's easier for someone not to do their due diligence and keep perpetuating the same stereotypical image of the veiled woman in the Middle East over and over again. And this just, you know, our job is to present the truth. And the truth is not always black and white. There's many shades of gray, specifically where women are concerned in the Middle East. And that is, not all women in the Middle East are the same. You can't say women in Saudi Arabia and women in Iran are part and parcel of the same, picture. That is another mistake, another stereotype that I get confronted with all the time. Everyone thinks that women in Lebanon, women in Iran, women in Saudi Arabia, all these women are all part of the same narrative, and it's so wrong because every country needs to be looked at within its own cultural context.
Professor Nahad, you've done studies of this. What is it that makes this narrative so believable, so easily spread, even though it's wrong? What is it about either our societies or our views of societies or our history that makes us want to believe that we're rescuing women who wear the veil in the Middle East by sending soldiers in?
I think part of it has to do with how we teach journalism. Like all the journalism books I use in my classes, when we start to look at news values, what makes a story attractive or what makes a story newsworthy, if you look at these news values, you have the odd/novelty. If something is just weird, it's unusual, that's going to be in the news. Something prominent, that's going to be in the news. So when we're in Iraq or when we're invading and having a war in Iraq or Afghanistan, that's prominence. It's something that's in the news. But then you focus on the odd things. The women in the burqas. That's something unusual we haven't seen. So we start to cover that. And while I talk about that, I want to talk about what makes it widespread. And in my view, the way we create these stereotypes and confirm and reconfirm them is three ways, generally speaking, three ways. The language we use. So when you read a lot of these stories, again, she walks in her ghostly abaya, or she sits silently, or she's helpless, needing help, and so on. And even the interesting thing is, even when the woman doesn't fit this stereotype, we use words that also make her, she's an exception. So-and-so is not your typical Muslim. Or if there's a Western shorthand for Muslim, it will be this person. And then, describing how these young, liberal, modern Western Muslims are ripping off their black, ugly abayas. And these are all words that I've found from my studies. or ripping off their ghostly, ugly abayas and replacing them with modern Western clothes. So again, it's the language we use. Even following more recent stories, stories on athletes. So there was a story on, can't remember the Middle Eastern country, but one athlete where she was described as, where was it? A wisp. So-and-so is a wisp of a young woman who looks as if one gust of wind would blow her away. And then the story of Nadia, who won the bake-off in the UK. There have been descriptions of her petite, tiny body. Again, maybe we can argue that this is just sexist language, but again, just pointing out to her weakness or the weak part in her. Language is one. Context. Context is very important, and a lot of times is missing from those stories, and it can make a huge difference in how your audience is reading or understanding the story. To give you an example from way back when we were in Afghanistan, a lot of the stories were parroting what was happening, what the Bush administration was saying. We're going to go in there and lift the veils off the women's faces and liberate them from the burqas. None of the stories that were parroting this same rhetoric were explaining what exactly is the burqa. What does it mean to women? How that it has in fact existed before the Taliban. And to no surprise, when the US finished and the Taliban are out, women still wear it. Some women by choice now don't, but a lot of women wear it. It's part of their tradition. They feel more comfortable wearing it out. So context is really important in providing your audience with just enough background to get what the story's about. And then another important factor that helps spread these stereotypes is your sources. Who are you relying on? Who are you quoting when you're saying these women are helpless or that they need us to save them? Who are you quoting? Sometimes it's not even a Muslim woman, and the other times it's women that are always, it's the same people we keep going to over and over and over, and they sort of become the experts. And it's funny because sometimes they're not even Muslim, like Ayan Hirsi Ali. She openly has said she is not Muslim. She is an ex-Muslim. Yet when a lot of reporters want to talk about Islam and how it impacts women, she's one of the first people they're going to go talk to. When we have a tremendous wealth of Muslim feminists, a lot of women's organizations in these Middle Eastern countries that can really help us understand more and give us a more accurate representation of these women. That's it.
Lisa, that's a pretty firm indictment of journalism in this regard, and I think that a lot of that is absolutely true. As a journalist covering the region, how do you begin to tell the story in a different way? How do you begin to get people to start looking at these kinds of issues, not so much as trying to prove a point about victimhood, but trying to describe exactly what the situation is? How can we begin to start doing that in journalism?
I'm working on it.
Yeah.
It's incredibly difficult. I told you on the phone when we were discussing this panel. I told you about an incident about something I experienced in Cairo.
Oh yes.
Yeah, and that story was actually really interesting for me. When in 2011 I went down to Cairo from Tel Aviv. I wanted to cover the revolution for 9/72, which was an intermittently successful project, shall we say? Anyways, I had quite a few Egyptian friends, and they introduced me around, and I met this one really terrific woman named Yasmin, who was very involved in political organizing in Tahrir Square going up to the elections. And it was really fantastic in Tahrir Square. There was this really sort of effervescent, excited atmosphere with like every single political faction represented and passing out manifestos on photocopied leaflets and so on. And so we went for coffee and at Cilantro, as one does. And she started telling me, Yasmin is like this she went to Harvard, she speaks 5 languages, she's very glamorous, she travels to Beirut to go shopping every month, but she was totally on the ground in Tahrir every single day during the uprising that led to the resignation of Mubarak. And she said that the person she worked most closely with was a Salafi woman who wore a niqab. And she said, I worked with her every single day on the square organizing people, and I spoke with her every single night on the phone for hours, and I spent way more time with her than I spent with my own family. She said, but we've never been alone together in the same room, so I have no idea what she looks like. And she said that she's like this incredibly dynamic, articulate, outgoing, tough woman who had a graduate degree and was studying medicine, I think. So this was a really interesting sort of, classic shattering the Middle East stereotype anecdote. And I couldn't think of a way to report that to my Israeli readers without making it sound like a cliche or binary or as if it were sort of desirable to be more like Yasmin, or it was I actually didn't tell the story because everything that I was writing, I was reporting in English for 972, but there was an Israeli journalist friend of mine was translating all of my articles into Hebrew, more or less in real time. And the Hebrew articles were getting way more attention than the English. Like the Israeli, Jewish, Hebrew-speaking readers who were following my reporting were kind of asking these really sort of dubious questions like, is Egyptian society really that complicated? They were used to sort of different, very sort of cliched images of Arabs, like the Effendi or the Felahin, and here I was talking about middle-class kids in their late 20s who spoke fluent English and were just like Israeli kids in their late 20s who spoke fluent English, and they wore the same clothes and listened to the same music, and they were and they also really valued political agency, and so I sort of felt like if I wrote that story in English and it got translated into Hebrew, that a lot would get lost in the translation, especially because around the same time there was an Israeli sort of social uprising that happened during the summer of 2011, and a lot of the Israeli activists seemed to wanted to identify with the Egyptians, and they started tweeting at them on Twitter and using some similar hashtags. And the Egyptians really didn't like the Israelis identifying with them either. They thought, they said, listen, this is our political struggle against authoritarianism, and it's not the local version of the Occupy movement, which is how the Israeli youth were sort of interpreting it. So I just found that, basically that's my very long and convoluted answer, and I haven't forgotten your question, which is that it's really, really hard. It's just, and a lot of times I figure it's just, this is going to get lost and I'm not going to bother.
But so the story of these young women who were not fitting a stereotype, essentially, that story is hard to tell.
Mm-hmm.
So let's explore why that story is hard to tell. I mean, why is it hard to tell stories that end this whole idea that somehow the West, in support of moderates, is basically doing the noble work of saving the lives of women, that the women themselves are helpless, the things that we've said. And I think that some of it may have to do with the whole concept of propaganda, and I want to talk about that. So we're talking about states in which people are in conflict, or if not warfare, in threat of it constantly, in the case of Israel and the Palestinian authorities. Propaganda is a political tool of communication to advance the position of one of the contestants. Do you believe that women in the Middle East are caught up in a propaganda war in some way? Nina, would you?
I wanted to touch on, again, specifically what Lisa said, and what you say, which is why does that narrative, that stereotypical narrative, that image get perpetuated? One, because as Lisa said, sometimes the real story is very difficult to convey, especially when you're given a certain number of words. I know that I've written many articles and it's been very difficult when you have a certain a number of words to allocate to really define the real story, which is that the story is so complicated sometimes, as Lisa mentioned, that you figure it's just almost easier to keep pointing the finger at the same old story. So, to rewrite how there's, for example, with women in Iran, I have to continuously say that, the Islamic Republic, again, is the face of Iran, but behind the Islamic Republic are people that don't reflect this regime. Specifically, and more importantly, the women of Iran don't reflect this regime, that they are way more advanced in terms of how this regime has tried to resurrect the image of the antiquated Muslim women and failed on every level to do so. It's also failed to engender a whole generation of women who subscribe to that antiquated ideology. It's also failed to resurrect a whole generation of men and women that subscribe to this outdated ideology, meaning that the population of Iran is actually more embracing of the West than actually mainstream media projects. All the rhetoric that Iran is against the West is so wrong, because behind this regime, behind the four people sitting on top, behind the hardline clerics who are in control, is really a population that is very open to the West, and that narrative always 99% gets lost in translation. And again, when you're talking about the nuclear deal, again, the regime is at the face of Iran, not the debilitating effects of the sanctions on the people of Iran, not to mention the debilitating effects of the gender discriminatory laws in conjunction with the sanctions that are really impacting a highly educated female population at large. So sometimes conveying that story in its true sense is complicated, and you always feel you have an audience that predominantly won't understand what you're trying to say, so it's almost like you surrender and think, this is really just too difficult of a climb.
And I think it's a dereliction of duty for a journalist to surrender in that way, but yes, please.
Yeah, I want to add something to what you were saying as well. I think, just to be fair, during the Arab uprisings, that was one of the fewest times that we saw really fair, objective reporting on the Middle Eastern women. I was almost getting used to seeing, daily articles on different, introducing you to different activists, showing the world that these women are, they are in control of their own agency. They're trying to do the change. They don't need us to come in there and help them. So that was really neat. However, there were also, like, if you're familiar with the culture, then you saw tiny hints of issues or problems with some of the reporting. To give you examples, does anyone remember Blue Bra Girl?
Oh, yes, very well.
That's a big issue. I mean, Blue Bra Girl was a girl who was fully covered from head to toe in Egypt, and after the revolution, when the military took over, people were still in the street protesting the military's control, and these soldiers just beat her up, stripped her abaya, her black robe, and she's lying there being kicked in the stomach, and we can only see her blue bra and her jeans. And the way the Western media focused or framed the story, it was all about the blue bra. I mean, it's awesome that she got attention, because it's a story that definitely needed to get attention. But if these reporters were paying attention to the activists on social media or in the street, they would have immediately gotten the message that this is not the right way to describe her. It was extremely offensive. No one in the Middle East referred to her as Blue Bra Girl. And in fact, they were debating on Twitter, on Facebook, what is the best name we can use to give her back her dignity, celebrate her, and they ended up, I think, calling her Tahrir Girl. So that's one example of where, yes, it was great coverage, but we still had some issues. And they mainly had to do with cultural sensitivity.
There's so many things to follow up on, but the questions of words like monolithic image of women, are a very bad word for journalists, by the way, because if you know anything about a country, you know there's no such thing. Anyone who tries to describe American women, for example, would need an encyclopedia perhaps and not a phrase, but people tend to cover women in the Middle East sort of with a sweeping kind of a brush. Let's talk about that context and that complexity. The last panel said that these complexities are the story, essentially, that getting this kind of complexity, this kind of context is so essential to being able to tell the full story. And Steve Call talked about the whole idea of framing a story, and sometimes stories are not framed with the sense that they're going to correct stereotypes or that they're going to do some other things to undamage the situation that was caused by previous reporting. At this point, do you feel that we've gotten to the point where we at least aren't calling aren't thinking of this region as monolithic, that somehow we see the Yemeni situation and well, Afghanistan's not in the region, but the Palestinian situation, the Yemeni situation is the same. I mean, it's hard for me to conceive of that. And if that's the case, what should we make sure should be in the contextual statements of these stories? What are the things that are complexing about it?
Is that for me or for
That's for anyone, but Lisa, you go ahead.
No,
Yeah,
no. Oh my God. My impression from following the news here is that people do still intend to see the Middle East as a monolith, you know, from Morocco to Saudi Arabia, and it's just really incredible for me. Like, for example, I mean, one of the issues that comes up a lot is FGM, female genital mutilation, which is quite rare. I mean, in the Arab Middle East, and it's practiced in Egypt, but other than that, no. But people will just, you know, people think it's a Muslim practice, and they think that it's, you know, that they practice it in Morocco. The whole North African anti-colonial legacy with France, which is so incredibly crucial for understanding Middle Eastern history, is just ignored in the English language media, so nobody understands what the motivating factors there and why things are different in Algeria than they were in Morocco. Weren't they both French colonies, you know? Mm-hmm. So, no, I don't actually think that, I think that, you know, obviously there are some terrific reporters for the major newspapers, but most people get their news in headlines and sound bites, and I think it's abysmal, really. The reporting is awful, and because the impressions people have, even intelligent people or educated people who don't focus in the Middle East, are just really ignorant.
I agree. Nina, would you like to say?
I'm very blunt.
I agree.
I agree with that, actually.
I agree with what Lisa says, specifically where my work is concerned, which is about women and what the consequences of having debilitating laws are. But specifically, again, the narrative gets framed that women in the Middle East are the only ones that face oppression. This is actually a global epidemic, and this needs to be placed again in the right narrative, so to speak. You know, everyone assumes, you know, women in Saudi Arabia, women in Iran are married off before, you know, the age of 15 or before the age of 18. That is so not true. That is true, but again, in a global context, if I cite some statistics, it's actually staggering where, again, mainstream journalism neglects to say that between 2011 and 2020, over 140 million girls worldwide will be married before the age of 18. Out of those girls, 50 million of them will be under the age of 15 specifically. Not to mention over 150 countries around the world have at least one gender discriminatory law. Over 100 countries don't have any laws that protect women against sexual harassment at work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So to frame the woman in the Middle East or the woman in Iran or the woman in Saudi Arabia as victims of this kind of patriarchal dimension is very erroneous and sets off the wrong information that is only you know, specific to that region, and it's not a global epidemic. So again, it's very difficult sometimes to talk to someone and say, you know, oppression is universal, it continues, and it should be framed in the proper context. I think the power of social media, specifically Twitter, has been instrumental in bringing and shattering a lot of the narratives that were for so long perpetuated by mainstream media. I think the borderless nature of Twitter specifically and other social media outlets has been very powerful to shatter a lot of what's been really held for so long as the real and authentic story. So I think the more voices communicate with one another on you know, through these various entities, I think it's one small step at a time, but I think it's just opening more and more doors.
Great. So I have one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. I wanted to talk about reclaiming the narrative, basically. And I wanted to ask Professor Nahed about this. The ethics of representation, the ethics of any kind of representation of other people other than ourselves is a subject that's in great demand of discussion. But there also is representing yourself and trying to figure out how to switch the narrative. Do you think that, Professor Nahad, do you think that this is a successful way to do it? Is there evidence that more women speaking out, more women blogging, writing about it?
I think
gonna change it?
definitely today you can find a whole lot more women to get in touch with to get a more accurate picture, whether on their blogs, through Twitter, through Facebook, through even Instagram. You know, you can make connections through any of these and try to get more access to women. It's not always going to work, and depending on what country or, you know, where women are allowed to talk more than, you know, if they have any political restrictions, but definitely with social media, we have a richer wealth of sources out there. That's one way to try and reclaim the narrative. Can I add other things?
Absolutely.
Definitely, just trying to maybe even like if you're going, back in the day when I worked as a Reuters correspondent in Cairo, we had an office, we still have, I think they still do have an office, but you had foreign correspondents who were learning the language, they were learning the culture, they were not in and out what we call parachute journalism, they were not in and out just to cover a story and go. So it was easier for them to understand a lot more about the culture. And when they were covering a story, like let's say on Sharia law and marriage, and they didn't get it, there were a lot of other Muslim and Arab journalists in the newsroom who could help, you know, translate what was happening. So maybe trying to focus more on that, or if we cannot have or can't afford to have these foreign offices in every country, at least go through some training, some cultural sensitivity training, depending on what the region, so if it's the Middle East, cultural sensitivity training, have women come in and talk about what are the most common errors or issues that they see and maybe how we can avoid it. That could be one. Trying to contact local fixers, local stringers. They're available. They can get you in touch with these women if you can't get in touch on your own. There are a lot of stringers who can help you, you know, contact women's organizations or other sources, you know, to try and get accurate interviews. Just knowing the language, this was something that came up in the previous panel. Knowing the language can really mean a big difference. But if you can't, again, at least have a translator, a stringer or a fixer who can help translate what's happening when you're trying to interview these women. These are all ways that can hopefully help, you know, get rid of some of these stereotypes. But another thing, when my two colleagues were talking about how we still have that, we haven't gotten rid of these issues, like what, you know, they still confuse Lebanon versus Algeria. I would say even within a country, we don't get how complex women are even within one country. So if you take Saudi Arabia, for example, all we see about Saudi Arabian women is the driving and the black abaya. We don't see a whole lot of, except for how, you know, we recently saw the voting news, but they're much more complex. Saudi Arabia has the highest rate, I think, one of the highest rates of women who go to graduate school abroad and getting scholarships from the government. They have a very high rate. The majority of Saudis out there getting grad school, they're women. You have a very high percentage of Saudi women who are in business. They own their own business and they're very successful. A lot of Saudi women have their own blogs and they're very vocal online, you know, on different issues, whether it's health or more political, more social. So women are more complex, more diverse, even within one country, and reporters hopefully should try and understand that. And just what Lisa was saying, you know, she talked to these two different women, and having that in the story would give your readers, would be a start to give readers an idea that, you know, oh, there's more to women in Egypt. They're not all like this or they're not all like that. So more of, you know, this type of reporting would hopefully have an effect.
Absolutely. Lisa, you have anything to add to that?
Just two points. One, for Israel, I often think that it's the coverage of what goes on in Israel and Palestine is at such a saturation level, and the microscope is on such a high definition that it distorts. And I often think that Israel and Palestine would be much better off with less reporting, and high quality and less. And I also think one of the things that really interested me starting from 2011 and even before that when I was reporting around the Middle East outside of Israel, Palestine, and also in Palestine actually, is that there's quite a high number of female journalists who are native Arabic speakers with fluent English reporting for the international media and the local media. And I think that that's a really interesting and important development. We haven't really yet felt its impact, but I suspect that we will quite soon. And just, for example, Madamasser, which is probably the only really independent media outlet, a digital native site coming out of Egypt, is founded and edited and managed by a female journalist who was a former Nieman scholar. So I expect that we'll see some changes in the reporting and how reporting is coming out of the Middle East. But these women who are reporting from, a lot of them under combat conditions, difficult conditions. They're really young. Some of them are like 25, 26. So maybe in a few years, when they become columnists and analysts and they get invited to Charlie Rose, and we see women on Charlie Rose, then our perceptions might change a bit.
Okay, so Nina, you describe in your writings what someone may think is normal things. So in other words, we're constantly in journalism talking about extraordinary things: war, migration, conflict, ISIS. Would we be helped by more coverage of women in the arts, women in politics, women who are doing things that are quote unquote more normal, as opposed to being victims of child marriage or something like that? And how can we get more of that kind of contextual sort of reality of life when we have so many people screaming and so many people fighting and so many sides and so much sectarianism? How can we begin to see women's lives as much more normal than being portrayed?
I think the most impactful way to give an authentic version of what's going on is not to put so much of your own voice and your own perception behind the words, but to actually go and talk to these women and use their voice versus your own voice. And I think not just one woman, you should put the voice of the secular woman, the religious woman, the woman who's an artist, the woman who's in the medical field. These are all voices that are hardly ever heard. Even if they're heard, we just give them a snippet within our own voices, and that really is, again, why stereotypes perpetuate, because we're always, as human beings, we're always putting in and infusing our version of what's going on. And I think we should, do our due diligence, but a form of responsible journalism and responsible reporting is to step outside and give more of a platform to the voices of diverse women.
Yeah. Excellent. So we're going to take questions now. Is there anyone with a question? Just come up to the mic there. Don't be shy.
Thank you all for doing the work that you do and insisting on getting it right. My question is regarding the editorial decisions that you kind of have to fight through when they try to put you in these boxes. And it's something that was touched upon in the last panel. Both Saad and Alia talked about insisting on, telling these complex stories, but also being given the space to tell those stories and being allowed to tell them. So have any of you ever had an experience where you write this piece and then when you see it published, it's been completely gutted and completely torn apart, or there's like a whole new spin on it? Because, I had this experience in a very limited way a few years ago. I was asked by the magazine Religion and Politics to write a piece on, it was right before the last presidential election, 2012, and they're writing, it was something called The Sunday Before the Election, and they're asking people to go into their different religious communities and talk about what's being said about the presidential elections and about voting. And I was the only Muslim voice asked to do this, and obviously it wasn't Sunday, it was a Friday. And so I wrote this piece, talking about the atmosphere, and this very colorful piece, and kind of putting a lot of like the imam's words into it and other people's words and voices. And when it was published, it was entirely rewritten, entirely. Like there was none of my voice left in it at all. And it became...
You weren't told by the editor they were going to make these changes?
They returned it to me right before it was, like midnight, the night it was going to be published the next morning at like 6 a.m. And I didn't want it to even go through. I wanted to pull my name completely. But then people started telling me, well, you're young, this is how you have to start out, including my mother. She was like, just, deal with it. This is what you have to put up with. This is how it's always going to be at the beginning, but you need to like get established. But it was absolutely heart-wrenching to have something up there with your name on it that wasn't at all your voice or your intention. And it became this very robotic piece talking about like, as the congregation commenced the familiar prayer movements of prostrating and standing up, and it was just entirely different. So I wonder if any of you have had that experience and how you deal with that.
Whoever.
Well, I mean, I've had it years ago. I'm no longer a reporter, but when I started out, definitely. But the way we did it, my editor would have me stand, while he edited, so you see what's happening. And when I look at some of these stories, most of them, I still save them, but most of them, there's no real big deal. But when I look at certain stories, yes, there's definitely context that maybe would have made sense if it was kept in there or if it was higher up. And maybe if I was older, more experienced, I would have had a say. But I get where you are at right now. You want your job, you want to at least secure a job. So, and why the editor does it, I think, again, it goes back to news values, what's newsworthy, what they feel the audience needs to hear, or what the audience will understand, what might be complicated, and maybe even having these stereotypes in the back of, or these molds, let's call them. You have a mold, and it's in the back of your head, and you have to fit that mold. You have to make the story and the characters fit what we're used to seeing.
I've had this experience not as a journalist, but as someone who's been giving interviews on her book. I just recently had an article that the UK Independent did pulled, specifically because I gave a 2-hour interview. The journalist decided to take snippets of what I said and put them in succession, where when you read it, I looked incredibly stupid. Not stupid as an unintelligent woman, but stupid in my topic. So the way a 2-hour interview flowed was put in to 4 paragraphs that literally one after the other had nothing to do with each other. I actually spent the last 48 hours either telling them to rectify this and put it in the proper context or pull the article, because this is really, really bad, an example of bad journalism. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the person interviewing me had just almost no knowledge of my topic, so she even probably, in all honesty, felt that the way it flowed made sense. Again, I'm so hesitant these days. This is just one of the many that has happened to me. I'm so hesitant these days, unless it's a live radio interview or an interview where my own voice is being a broadcast, to give an interview that goes on for 2 hours that's recorded and transcribed in an erroneous manner. So I understand your frustration and feel your pain.
I don't have much to add. Yeah, but it gets better, obviously as you establish your reputation, and then you can afford to throw your weight around a bit. I recommend throwing your weight around a lot. And one of the things I gave a couple of newspapers sort of a second chance after they've really screwed me over, and we agreed that they would send me a PDF of the final agreed upon version, and they couldn't make any changes after I signed off on the final version. You don't always get that privilege though, so sometimes you just have to decide, do I want the byline or do I want the credibility, and sometimes just turn it down.
But I can't stress that you're going to have to fight to get things that run counter to what is the prevailing winds of journalism. Whenever you do that, you're going to have to be a fighter. Just add that.
Nina Ansari has already given a partial answer to my question. My question is, do you all view American news reports as particularly stupid and stereotypic in comparison to reports and news media in other countries, or not? Are we dealing here with a specifically American illness or a more general?
I just got back from the UK, and I thought this was specific to America, and having been in different parts of Europe and the UK, found that it's not just specific to America. I was guilty of thinking that, the American mainstream media just perpetuates and builds on the same narrative over and over again. But I realized, being outside of America, that that is not just applicable to this country. So I think I was actually stunned, because sometimes we think Others are more sophisticated and more knowledgeable than we are, and that is definitely not the case, I can assure you. So I came back actually thinking, wow, in many ways I came back here thinking we're actually not as stupid or, as you said, pathetic or one-sided, that this is just sort of something that just continues and is just, border after border, the same story and the same, I don't know if it's ignorance. I don't know if it's something that they think might not sell. I really can't figure out. I really can't. This is something that I'm struggle with to try to figure out why someone would not want to do as a reporter their due diligence. Someone would not want to really depict the real story and just builds on the same old story over and over again, whether it's the U.S., whether it's the U.K., whether it's in Italy. It's that rhetoric that keeps just like a domino effect going on and on. I don't know. It's very frustrating. So I wanted to tell you that having just come back, this is not just a U.S. problem.
How's the Israeli press on this issue?
Oh my God. Well, it depends. I mean, it's a diverse and well, it's a tough. It's not lately. Okay, the problem with these, the Israeli media actually has some terrific columnists and some really fantastic journalists. The problem is that whenever there's an uptick in violence or whatever metaphor you want to use to describe what's going on right now, for example, is that the press tends to really fall in line on security issues. You see that you saw that here, I think, during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where the media really was afraid to question, and the same thing happens in the Israeli media. It's going on right now, with very few people questioning the government's narrative and really focusing on security issues. So.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi. I just want to reiterate what one of the people who asked a question said. Keep doing what you do. It's amazing to even hear you speak. So you talked quite a lot about it's problematic, the stereotypical coverage that we get out of the region. My question is quite basic. When I'm not talking to my friends about how women are covered in the Middle East, where is the wider conversation happening? What can I follow in terms of forums or, I don't know, groups or even in social media? What are your recommendations on following conversation around that issue?
Good question. Who wants to take that one on?
I'll tell you what I follow. I just follow different women, diverse women from all backgrounds. Religious women, conservative women, liberal women, politically active women, women, like if you just go on, depending on what country, what area, what region, like if it's the Middle East, you can start out by looking at some of the prominent activists, and from there you can find your way. Like on Twitter, it's really easy to just find who's being followed, who's active, who's tweeting a lot, and from, it's easy to find your way there. But that's where I find a lot of the conversations that are really interesting, and like going back to the blue bra thing, that's how I found that women were angry. It's by listening to their conversation, and some of them were actually tweeting to some of the Western journalists and pleading with them, please stop tweeting, or please stop using this in your headline. So it's only by following these activists on Twitter that I was, and not just activists, artists, writers, like I follow Nina on Twitter. So it's interesting just to, you get different perspectives, different topics on all diverse issues just by following different people.
Thank you. No, I wanted to also say specifically where Nahid built on that I generally don't gravitate and don't recommend gravitating, whether it's an activist, whether it's an artist, whether it's a politician, to anyone who has an angry voice. Well,
it's interesting.
Well, because I think anger is pointless. I think it's fruitless. I think for me, it's repelling. I don't think it accomplishes anything to be derogatory, disrespectful, and convey your message in an angry manner. So I wanted to give you just a little piece of advice. Gravitate towards those who are, first of all embracing, that do not put other people down for their own ideologies that are not necessarily in sync with them. I'm a fan of the more the merrier. I think I love to sit on a panel versus just stand myself and give a sermon. So I always think every voice counts as long as it's done in a respectful manner. I think we can make a point by not putting other people down. So as just a small recommendation to you, I know Nahid said Twitter's great, and we know women like us gravitate towards one another, and I think you should only gravitate to those voices that are peaceful, that want peaceful resolution, that are all about making a difference and bringing about change in a respectful manner.
I don't know. I'm very aggressive on Twitter, so I don't know. But I have found the conversations on social media really, really enlightening about issues in the Middle East, especially around the issue of the veil and feminism in the Muslim world and in the Arab world in general. Like, for example, when Muna al-Tahawi's article came out and then her book, and it was, it seemed like the American and British media were all over her and excited about it, and all of these Arab journalists that I followed and really respected hated it. So I wanted to find out why they hated it so much. I read Mona's article. I didn't, she's not here, right? I know her. I don't see her hair. So okay, so and I actually know Mona, and she's a friend of mine, but I don't like her book. Sorry. And but I wanted to understand. I wanted to have the vocabulary to explain to myself why I disliked her book, and I actually found some terrific, not angry reviews of her book, like the one by Kim Gattas, for example, which I really recommend. So I agree with my colleagues. Don't follow angry people except me, and really do follow people who just sound interesting and look for sort of counterintuitive voices. I find that super enlightening.
What about real life conversations? Is this happening in an actual forum where women get together and talk about this? That's not like a panel at Columbia?
It depends on the topic. And that's another thing that's important, because sometimes we get so involved in the social media that we forget that real life is also important. And sometimes it's really different, because one of the jokes that a lot of Egyptian activists like to say is, those of us who are on social media live in our own bubble and we don't know anything about what's happening in the streets. So again, it depends. Like if you're looking at sexual harassment, let's say in Egypt, you're going to find groups that meet, that do workshops, that have conversations, that train women or talk to them, so you can go join that conversation. It really depends on the topic and what group you want to join. But you're definitely going to find some group. And it might be easy to find them via social media, like a Facebook page, and then go out and attend the real conversation.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I actually wanted to piggyback back off of something that Lisa mentioned, which is we are getting a lot more of investigative journalism from people on the ground, nationals who have better contexts, better language skills, and better, networks. My question is, how do we encourage more investigative journalism from nationals on the ground where in the country they live it may be a threat? And how do we protect their security when we are moving towards much more freelancing and away from, having these institutionalized protections?
Lisa, do you want to take that up?
Yeah, I might as well. It's really hard. There are some people in the audience who can speak to that from personal experience. Hi, Aliyah. There was actually an article published 2 or 3 years ago in the Columbia Journalism Review by an Italian woman who was then reporting from Aleppo, which was, there were still reporters in Aleppo. And she said, look, I'm under fire. I had to pay for my own sat phone, my own flak jacket, my own helmet, and I'm getting paid. I have to pitch every single article, and I'm getting paid 90 euros for a reported piece that I can maybe collect in 6 or 7 weeks if I don't, if I push really, really hard. So it's just, I don't really know. Obviously a lot of organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I think also the BBC has some outreach as well. They do try to offer some protection to journalists in the field, but I think because of the financial realities and also the political realities, that there just isn't that much. People who go out and report on the ground right now in high-risk areas are putting themselves at terrific risk, and we're seeing that over the past few years in reporters who are being abducted, who are disappearing, who are coming under violent assault, and a lot of them who are just saying, it's not worth it. I can give you a really kind of maybe a less An example that might not seem quite as extreme as the ones that we saw, for example, in Syria, but just right now, I had a conversation last night with an Israeli photojournalist friend of mine who has been covering the West Bank and Palestine for 12 years, and during the Second Intifada as well. And he said that it's right now too dangerous for Israeli journalists to go to the West Bank, outside of Ramallah, which is a little bit of a bubble. So he's not going, and he said most of his colleagues are staying home as well. It's just, there's just no protection.
And can I add one thing?
Yeah.
Just better training. A lot of countries in the Middle East, we don't really focus a lot on investigative reporting. So reporters need to be trained how to conduct investigative reporting, what to do, what to ask, where to go, how to protect yourself. Because a lot of reporters don't really know, because when you've lived in a society where you have a lot of corruption, where you know you're not allowed to write about these people or uncover this government official's corruption, you don't really do it that much, or you don't know how to do it. So maybe just better training.
Yeah, the BBC does that too. It's interesting.
They do that?
Yeah, they send people out to train. They did that in Tunisia, for example.
The other thing is, there are some small efforts to train Arabic-speaking native Arab reporters to do investigative reporting. As Professor Nihad mentioned, it's not really in the tradition of journalism in most regions, really. But there are programs where people are now being trained to actually do reporting on their own, in their own countries. It's probably just as dangerous, but at least there's training going on.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. This has been a fantastic panel. Dr. Ansari earlier mentioned about how Westerners look at women in different countries and sort of lump them together. As a news consumer, I'm just wondering, I follow a lot of different conversations on Twitter and social media specifically about different issues in the Middle East concerning women. What would you recommend to young news consumers in the Western world for issues concerning women in the Middle East in various countries that have been underreported by the Western world? Like, is there anything specific in Tunisia or Egypt that we haven't heard of?
That's a great question. What's important is to, as you know, we all have a duty to do a lot of our own due diligence before delving into a topic. I have to say I was guilty of a lot of unknowns, specifically because I'm a woman born in Iran. I left in Iran at the cusp of the revolution, and a lot of the narrative I held came from mainstream media for 37 years, and also family and friends. So I think a very important premise is, as a woman, to know that women's rights activists in Iran, a lot of them refuse to refer to themselves as feminists. But that doesn't diminish from their work. So you need to be able to do your due diligence and know that this woman does not refer to herself as a feminist, but as a women's rights activist. A lot of women in Iran refer to themselves as Islamic feminists. So to do your due diligence, and it's not easy. So a lot of times when I'm asked about women in nearby regions of Iran, I actually say I cannot comment accurately in a manner that doesn't lead, again, to misperception and stereotypes, because I think when you start to comment on things specifically from you mean well and you think you know the story, but I think sometimes that leads to more misperceptions. So I think what is important is to reach out to women and know who you're reaching out to specifically. And like I said, when I have discussions with women in Iran on Twitter, I know the ones who don't like to be referred to when I tweet about them specifically as feminists. I refer to them as women's rights activists. So that respectful communication has to exist, because, like I mentioned, what you and I might consider okay is not okay with some women. So we have to learn to respect their religious backgrounds, their cultural context of how they like to refer to themselves. So that's one bit of advice I have for you.
Thank you. And more specifically, what are issues in the Middle East concerning women that are just not reported in the Western world? Like, what specifically for all three of you?
What's really underreported is the number of women's rights activists in Iran, for example, who are continuously jailed and pay a high price for their peaceful activism. That is coming out more and more on Twitter and Facebook, with a lot of people actually starting petitions to free these women. This actually does make a difference when you draw attention on the outside and give these women a voice. That's very, again, if you turn the news channels on after 4 p.m., none of these women are reported about. I mean, barely. The only one that really got coverage was only because she was a British Iranian citizen, was Ghoncha Ghabami, who was trying to get into an all-male volleyball sport, right? What? So yeah, women in Iran are banned from, going to all-male. That's sort of kind of changing now because, again, her plight brought a lot of attention, but not. Again, because she was British Iranian, she lives in the UK, she was visiting family, so the British government got involved. That got some coverage, but you're quintessential a woman in Iran who live in Iran and pay a high price for doing things like that, just go under the radar, unnoticed. You turn on the TV, that same narrative about Iran is always getting reported, which is the supreme leader said this, and then Javad Zarif said this, and nothing about any of these women and the high price they're paying, and to give these women a voice and draw attention to their plight. None of this, hardly ever gets covered by mainstream media, and that's really shameful. It's a crime. And I think we all have a duty to amplify the voices of these women, because if you don't do that, the hope there's no hope for change if you don't draw attention to these. This lady was jailed for 5 months, but because of what she suffered and because of some mainstream media coverage, now the regime is partially reversed some of these laws whereby women can attend certain all-male sports. So this does make a difference when it's brought into the mainstream.
I would add, in Egypt, there are a lot of also political activists, female, who have been in prison under Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, General al-Sisi. Some of them are as young as 17, 18, and we might read 1-2 stories about them, and then that's it. They're forgotten. Bahrain, a lot of female activists have been in prison in Bahrain. Again, 1 or 2 stories, and then we don't hear about them. So just keeping certain stories alive or trying to figure out where they are. Another story in Egypt, the sexual harassment was a huge story, it was a big story, but when we come to how women are countering that, I don't see a whole lot of stories. One of the things that really angered me was when, is it Lara Logan? Was that her name?
Yeah, Lara Logan.
When she was sexually harassed in Cairo, right on the day I think that Mubarak stepped down. It was a huge story, and the whole focus was, of course, on just how horrible of an attack that was. But it turns out that the people who saved her were a group of women. They actually just warned her and used their own abayas, their black abayas, to help her, rescue her, and cover her. That wasn't really mentioned, and if it was something really tiny. But that's just one example of how it's a tiny act that these women did, but it just goes, no one looks at it. But today, women are doing a whole lot in terms of activism, whether it's for sexual harassment or other issues, and we don't really hear a lot about it today.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got 4 more minutes. So.
Okay. Hi. So the 3 of you have spoken about telling news stories of different women that are not really presented in media today. And here at the Arab Students Association, we were trying to start a film series of screenings about some kind of issue, and we were thinking of women as our topic for this year. And one of the students, who's a woman from Lebanon, said that she was worried that our films would just show how women are oppressed in the Middle East and not help this image of this. So we started trying to brainstorm and find films that would show empowerment of Arab women. And I was just, as an Arab woman who grew up in Morocco and who basically had her first 18 years of her life criticizing women oppression in her country, it's really hard to strike that balance between showing that oppression exists, but at the same time that there are empowered women who are trying to fight. I was wondering how the three of you work towards striking that balance?
I mean, oppression exists everywhere. We're not going to deny or pretend it doesn't exist. So you're going to have to show films that show us what's happening. But then on the other hand, you can counter it and show what women are doing, if there are cases where women are doing something. So we're not going to lie. You know, problems exist everywhere. And as I think, Nina, you mentioned earlier, even here, in every culture, every society, you have some type of oppression on minorities. So you're just going to have to show it, but on the other hand, show how women are dealing with it, if they're dealing with it.
I think that's a great point, to show the oppression, but then to flip it and show their triumphs as well. A phenomenal example of this is Malala. I mean, the way the story started out was, you know, in context, tragic, but the way she triumphed over adversity is, again, so you have to show, you can't show Malala today without showing Malala in its original context. So you should follow your heart and show women who are oppressed, but as Nahid said, show their triumphs as well, because that gives so many women hope and also that you can prevail.
I mean, it's a less relevant question for me, I guess. But you know, I'm thinking about that Egyptian film called The Bus 678, I think it was called.
Yeah, 6, 7, 8.
So I've watched it a couple of times, and I watched it before I went to Egypt, and it really, I mean, obviously these women are victimized by terrible sexual harassment that they experience every single day. But at the same time, they sort of find a way to take agency as well. And I actually found it a very insightful and compassionate film. It didn't make me look at Egyptian women as victims. It actually made me see them as more complex than I initially had. So, you know, I don't think that every film about female victims needs to be a film about victimization, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question? If not, I can't sum this up. This has been an incredibly rich conversation. Takeaway points, of course, are almost the same as the takeaway points from the morning conference. That is, this is a complex story. The complexities of issues involving gender, when we're talking about more than half the population, we're talking about, in many cases, people who haven't had a voice for a generation or so. This is a complex task and must be done with some care, some understanding, some context, some history, some feeling, with your eyes open, some understanding that propaganda happens in conflict, that our Congress is attempting to make Iran, the people who are opposed to the deal, to be the patriarchal abuser of women, that it isn't, it's exaggerated, and that we as journalists have to cut through that to the truth. And a large part of the truth is talking to the women themselves about what's happening. So with that, have a good lunch. The next panel is going to be about music and all that kind of good stuff, so probably be a whole lot more people. But I think this is a very important discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.